Welcome back to Whispered Empires, where ancient mysteries meet modern discovery. Tonight, we journey through time to uncover the complete story of Japan. A tale of gods and warriors, emperors and shoguns, isolation and transformation. Before we begin, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our deep explorations into history's most fascinating civilizations. When the last ice age loosened its grip on the earth, something remarkable stirred on the islands at the edge of Asia. The sea levels had not yet risen to their present heights. The Japanese archipelago was still tethered to the continent by narrow land bridges. And across these bridges came the first people. They arrived not as conquerors but as seekers, hunter-gatherers drawn by forests thick with game, rivers alive with salmon, coastlines rich with shellfish. They carried stone tools and animal skins. They knew fire. They knew survival. But what they would create in these misty islands would exceed anything their ancestors could have imagined. Around 14,000 years before the Common Era, these early inhabitants began to transform. They discovered something profound, that clay, shaped and fired, could hold water, store food, preserve the harvest. This was the birth of pottery in Japan. Not simple vessels, but objects of beauty. They pressed cords into wet clay, creating patterns that spiraled and looped like the currents of the sea. Archaeologists call this the JapanPeriod, named after those cord-marked designs. It lasted for more than 10 millennia, one of the longest continuous cultures in human history. The Japan people were not primitive. They built pit dwellings, villages of surprising sophistication. They crafted figurines called dogu, mysterious clay forms that might have been gods or ancestors or something beyond our understanding. Their world was one of rhythm and season. Spring brought the salmon runs. Summer, the ripening of chestnuts and acorns. Autumn, the hunt for deer and boar. Winter, the long nights by the fire, when stories were told and the spirits of the forest seemed closest. They lived in harmony with the land, taking only what they needed, leaving offerings for the kami. The spirits that dwelled in every tree, every stone, every rushing stream. But nothing lasts forever. Around 900 years before the Common Era, new waves of migration began. This time, the arrivals came with knowledge that would reshape the archipelago. They brought rice cultivation, the art of wet-field farming that could feed far more mouths than hunting and gathering ever could. They brought bronze and iron, metals that could be forged into tools and weapons of unprecedented power. This was the Yayoi period, named after the Tokyo district where their pottery was first discovered. The Yayoi people did not erase the Japan culture. They merged with it, blended with it, created something new. Villages grew into towns. Towns grew into settlements defended by wooden palisades. Social hierarchies emerged. Some families accumulated wealth, power, influence. The age of equality was ending. The age of kings was beginning. Chinese chronicles from the 3rd century describe a land called Wa, the early name for Japan. They speak of more than 100 small kingdoms scattered across the islands. Among them, one stood out, a realm ruled by a queen named Himiko. She was a shaman, a priestess who spoke to the spirits and ruled through divination and ritual. Her capital, Yamatai, was a place of mystery. Even today, historians debate where it stood. As centuries passed, burial practices revealed the growing stratification of society. Great earthen mounds began to appear, keyhole-shaped tombs called coffin that could span hundreds of meters. Around these tombs stood ranks of hanawa, hollow clay cylinders shaped like warriors, horses, houses, and dancers. They were guardians for the dead, companions for the journey to the afterlife. The largest of these tombs belonged to the Yamato clan, who by the 4th century had emerged as the dominant power in central Japan. The Yamato rulers claimed descent from Amaterasu, the sun goddess herself. This divine lineage gave them authority that transcended mere military strength. They were not just kings, they were intermediaries between heaven and earth. Through strategic marriages, military conquest, and religious authority, the Yamato gradually unified rival clans under their banner. They established a court in Asuka, a region in what is now Nara Prefecture. It It was here that Japan would begin its transformation from a collection of warring chiefdoms into a centralized state. The year was 538 CE, or perhaps 552, the chronicles differ. But what arrived that year would change Japan forever. An embassy from the Korean kingdom of Baekje crossed the sea bearing gifts, Buddhist scriptures, ritual objects, and a golden statue of the Buddha. This was not just a religion. It was a gateway to the advanced civilizations of China and Korea, to writing systems, architectural techniques, and political philosophies that could transform a kingdom into an empire. The arrival of Buddhism ignited fierce debate among the great clans. The conservative Mononobe and Nakatomi families saw it as a foreign contamination, a threat to the native kami and the rituals that sustained the land. The Soga clan saw opportunity, a chance to connect with continental power and prestige. In 587 CE, the conflict turned violent. At the Battle of Shijusen, the Soga defeated the Mononobe, and Buddhism's place in Japan was secured. With the Soga ascendant, one of the most remarkable figures in early Japanese history emerged, Prince Shotoku. Born in 574 CE, Shotoku served as regent under Empress Suko. He was a devout Buddhist, a scholar, and a visionary statesman. He commissioned great temples, including Horyuji, which still stands today as one of the world's oldest wooden structures. In 604 CE, Shotoku issued the 17-article constitution, a document that blended Buddhist compassion with Confucian order. Harmony is to be valued, it began, a principle that would echo through Japanese history for centuries. The constitution emphasized respect for hierarchy, integrity in officials, and obedience to the sovereign. It was not a legal code in the modern sense, but a moral framework for governance. Shotoku also opened diplomatic channels with China's Sui dynasty. In 607 CE, he sent an embassy bearing a letter that began, "From the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun rises, to the Son of Heaven in the land where the sun sets." The Chinese emperor was reportedly offended by the presumption of equality. But the message was clear. Japan would no longer be content to remain in China's shadow. After Shotoku's death in 622 CE, the Soga clan continued to dominate the court, but their power bred resentment. In 645 CE, a young prince named Naka no Oi, allied with Nakatomi no Kamatari, staged a bloody coup. The head of the Soga clan was assassinated during a court ceremony. The clan's grip on power was shattered. Out of this violence came the Taika reforms, proclaimed in 646 CE. These sweeping changes aimed to remake Japan along Chinese lines. All land was declared property of the state, to be redistributed to peasants who would pay taxes and provide labor. A census system was introduced. Provinces were reorganized. Officials were appointed by the central court rather than hereditary clans. The goal was to weaken the great families and strengthen imperial authority. The reforms were ambitious, but implementation was difficult. Powerful clans retained much influence, and resistance simmered. Yet the Taika reforms marked a turning point, the first deliberate effort to craft a centralized bureaucratic state in Japan. In the decades that followed, Japan's rulers continued to look to Tang China for models. In 710 CE, the Japanese court took its most ambitious step yet, the construction of a permanent capital at Haijokyo, known today as Nara. For centuries, Japanese capitals had been temporary, relocated after each emperor's death to avoid ritual pollution. But Nara would be different. It was laid out on a grand rectangular grid modeled after Chang'an, the Tang capital, with broad avenues, palace precincts, and administrative offices. The Nara period lasted from 710 to 794 CE. It was an age of monumental achievements. Buddhist temples rose across the capital, their architecture blending continental styles with emerging Japanese aesthetics. The most spectacular was Todaiji, home to the Great Buddha, a bronze statue over 15 meters tall, symbolizing the state's embrace of Buddhism as a pillar of governance. Emperor Shomu, who reigned from 724 to 749 CE, envisioned Buddhism as the spiritual foundation of the realm. In 741 CE, he ordered the construction of provincial temples throughout Japan, creating a network that radiated imperial authority into even the most distant regions. These temples were not just places of worship, they were instruments of state power. The Nara period also produced Japan's earliest written histories. In 712 CE, the Kojiki was completed, a chronicle that blended myth and history to trace the imperial line back to the sun goddess Amaterasu. 8 years later, the Nihon Shoki offered a more detailed and formal account, written in classical Chinese. These works were not neutral histories but instruments of ideology, crafted to legitimize the rule of the Yamato dynasty as eternal and divinely ordained. Yet beneath the splendor of Nara, tensions simmered. The close ties between Buddhism and state power bred corruption. Temples accumulated vast estates. Monks became politically entangled. The most notorious example was the monk Dokyo, who in the late 8th century rose to extraordinary influence under Empress Shotoku. He sought to become emperor himself, alarming the aristocracy before being exiled after the empress's death. By the late 8th century, the court sought to restore balance. In 784 CE, Emperor Kanmu moved the capital briefly to Nagaoka, and then in 794 CE established a new capital at Heian-kyo, the city we now call Kyoto. This marked the end of the Nara period and the beginning of the Heian period, which would last nearly 4 centuries. Heian-kyo was designed as a fresh start, a capital removed from the political turbulence and Buddhist institutional power of Nara. Laid out on an elegant grid, with the imperial palace at its northern edge, the city would remain Japan's capital for over 1,000 years. But the move did not solve the underlying tensions. Instead, it set the stage for new patterns of power, ones that would define the Heian period. The Heian period, lasting from 794 to 1185 CE, is remembered as the golden age of classical Japanese court culture. While the emperor remained the symbolic sovereign, real political power gradually shifted to aristocratic families. Above all, the Fujiwara clan. Through strategic marriages, the Fujiwara placed their daughters as imperial consorts and positioned themselves as regents and chief advisors. By the 11th century, the Fujiwara had perfected this system. Fujiwara no Michinaga, who dominated court politics from 995 to 1028 CE, famously wrote, "This world, I think, is indeed my world." His daughters married emperors, his grandsons became emperors, and his influence extended into every corner of governance. The emperor performed rituals. The Fujiwara governed. Heian court culture was defined by exquisite refinement. Aristocrats lived in sprawling mansions where daily life revolved around poetry, music, calligraphy, and elaborate ceremonies. The pursuit of beauty, miyabi, was central to identity. Courtiers communicated through poetry, and a single verse could convey affection, rivalry, or subtle criticism. Seasonal festivals, romantic intrigues, and aesthetic competitions filled the calendar. Out of this world emerged some of Japan's greatest literary masterpieces. Around 1008 CE, Murasaka Shikibu, a lady-in-waiting at court, composed the tale of Genji, often called the world's first novel. It narrates the life and loves of Prince Genji with psychological depth and lyrical beauty, offering a vivid portrait of Heian court life, its fragile emotions, fleeting pleasures, and profound sense of impermanence. Another court lady, Sei Shonagon, authored the Pillow Book, a witty, insightful collection of observations, lists, and anecdotes that captured the refined sensibilities and social dynamics of the aristocracy. Together with the tale of Genji, it reveals a culture where aesthetic accomplishment and emotional intelligence were prized above all else. But while the Heian court pursued beauty and ceremony, the provinces were changing. The centralized Ritsuryo system established during the Nara period began to break down. Land redistribution proved impractical, and aristocrats and temples accumulated private estates called shon, which were exempt from taxation. These estates increasingly operated beyond central government control. To protect their estates and enforce order, provincial elites began recruiting armed retainers, warriors skilled in mounted archery and swordsmanship. These fighters came to be known as samurai, from the verb saburao, meaning to serve. Initially low in status, they gradually developed their own distinctive values, practices, and family networks, emphasizing martial prowess, loyalty, and practical administration rather than courtly refinement. Two great warrior clans rose to prominence: the Taira, or Haika, and the Minamoto, or Genji. Both claimed descent from imperial princes but had built their power through military strength in the provinces. By the 12th century, these samurai clans were indispensable to the court, summoned to suppress rebellions and maintain security in a realm where central authority was weakening. In 1156 CE, the Shogun rebellion erupted over a succession dispute, pitting rival factions of the court against each other. The Taira and Minamoto fought on opposing sides, marking the first time samurai became the decisive actors in imperial politics. 3 years later, the Heiji rebellion of 1159 CE further entrenched their role. The Taira, under Taira no Kayamori, emerged victorious, crushing the Minamoto and consolidating their influence at court. Taira no Kayamori became the most powerful man in Japan. He married his daughter into the imperial family, and in 1180 CE, his grandson Entoku was enthroned as emperor at the age of 2. Kayamori moved the capital briefly to Fukuhara and dominated court politics. But his arrogance bred resentment among both traditional aristocrats and rival warriors. In the eastern provinces, the defeated Minamoto regrouped under Minamoto no Yoritamo. In 1180 CE, Prince Machihito issued a call to arms against the Taira, sparking the Genpei War, a 5-year conflict that would transform Japan's political structure and establish samurai dominance for centuries to come. The war raged across Japan. The Taira initially held the advantage, controlling the capital and its resources. But the Minamoto built alliances among provincial warriors and gradually turned the tide. The most brilliant Minamoto commander was Yoritamo's younger half-brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a legendary tactician whose daring raids and surprise attacks became the stuff of legend. The climax came in 1185 CE at the Battle of Dan-no-Yura, fought in the Shimonoseki Strait. The Minamoto fleet, aided by defectors from the Taira ranks, decisively defeated the enemy. As the battle turned against them, the Taira made a final, desperate act. The child emperor Entoku's grandmother took him in her arms, whispered prayers, and leapt into the sea. Many others followed. The Taira clan was annihilated. With his enemies destroyed, Minamoto no Yoritamo emerged as Japan's paramount military and political leader. In 1192 CE, he received the title of Sei Taishogun, barbarian-subduing great general, from the emperor, reviving an ancient military designation. But Yoritamo transformed it into something new, the foundation of a military government, or bakufu, that would rule Japan for the next 7 centuries. Yoritamo established his headquarters at Kamakura, a coastal town far from the intrigues of Kyoto. This geographic separation was deliberate. While the emperor remained in the old capital, performing rituals and preserving symbolic authority, real power now rested with the shogun and his samurai retainers in Kamakura. This dual system, imperial court and military government, would define Japanese politics for centuries. To maintain control, Yoritamo created a network of military governors, shugo, and estate stewards, jito, throughout Japan. These loyal samurai administrators answered directly to the shogun, bypassing traditional court bureaucracy. Land rights were formalized through written oaths of loyalty, creating a feudal hierarchy bound by personal bonds rather than abstract law. Yet Yoritamo's victory did not bring him peace. He grew suspicious and ruthless, even turning against his own brother Yoshitsune, whose popularity and military brilliance threatened the shogun's authority. Yoshitsune was hunted across Japan and eventually took his own life in 1189 CE. When Yoritamo himself died in 1199 CE, perhaps from a fall from his horse, his direct line quickly ended. His sons were assassinated, and power passed to his widow's family, the Hojo clan. The Hojo did not claim the shogunate for themselves. Instead, they ruled as regents, shikken, for figurehead shoguns, creating a system where real authority was veiled behind layers of nominal rule. This complex arrangement, emperor delegating to shogun, who was controlled by Hojo regent, reflected a distinctively Japanese approach to political legitimacy, where direct power was often hidden behind ceremonial authority. The Kamakura period witnessed significant cultural developments alongside political transformation. New forms of Buddhism emerged that were more accessible to ordinary people. Pure Land Buddhism, taught by Honen and his disciple Shinran, emphasized salvation through faith in Amida Buddha rather than elaborate rituals. Zen Buddhism, introduced by monks such as Eisai and Dogen, focused on meditation and direct experience of enlightenment, resonating deeply with the warrior class. Samurai values began to crystallize during this era. Warriors were expected to demonstrate loyalty to their lords, courage in battle, and readiness to face death without hesitation. The relationship between lord and vassal, formalized through land grants and service obligations, became the foundation of samurai identity. Though the term Bushido, the way of the warrior, would not become common until centuries later, its core principles were already taking shape. The greatest test of the Kamakura shogunate came from beyond Japan's shores. By the 1270s, the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan had conquered China, Korea, and much of Asia. In 1268 CE, Mongol envoys arrived in Japan demanding tribute. The Hojo regents rejected the demands. Kublai responded with force. In 1274 CE, a Mongol fleet of 900 ships carrying 30,000 troops invaded Japan, landing at Hakata Bay in Kyushu. The samurai, accustomed to individual combat and ritualized warfare, were shocked by Mongol tactics. Coordinated cavalry charges, explosive projectiles, and overwhelming force. Yet after fierce fighting, a sudden storm struck, forcing the invaders to retreat with heavy losses. 7 years later, in 1281 CE, Kublai launched an even larger invasion. Two massive fleets, totaling perhaps 140,000 men, converged on Kyushu. Japanese defenders fought desperately behind hastily constructed coastal defenses. Then, in August, another powerful typhoon struck, more devastating than the first. The Mongol armada was shattered, thousands drowned, and the survivors limped home in defeat. The Japanese called these storms kamikaze, divine winds, seeing them as proof that the gods protected Japan from foreign conquest. This belief in divine protection would echo through Japanese history. But the victories came at a cost. Maintaining defenses and mobilizing armies without conquering new lands for reward strained the shogunate's resources and left many samurai disgruntled. By the early 14th century, cracks appeared in the Kamakura system. Economic pressures, succession disputes, and the arrogance of the Hojo regents alienated allies. In 1331 CE, Emperor Go-Daigo, seeking to restore imperial rule, launched the Genko War. Though initially captured and exiled, Go-Daigo escaped and rallied support. Crucially, two powerful samurai leaders, Ashikaga Takauji and Nitta Yashisada, turned against the Hojo. In 1333 CE, Nitta's forces attacked Kamakura. After desperate fighting, the city fell. The last Hojo regent, Hojo Takatoki, committed ritual suicide along with hundreds of his retainers. The Kamakura shogunate, which had ruled for nearly 150 years, was extinguished. The age of direct warrior rule had ended, but only briefly. Emperor Go-Daigo attempted to restore direct imperial rule through what became known as the Kenmu Restoration. But his vision of a Confucian-style monarchy alienated the very warriors who had brought him to power. He rewarded court nobles rather than samurai, ignoring the military leaders who had defeated the Hojo. Ashikaga Takauji, disillusioned with Go-Daigo's policies, raised his banner in rebellion. By 1336 CE, he had seized Kyoto and installed a rival emperor from a different branch of the imperial family. Go-Daigo fled to the mountainous Yoshino region, establishing a competing southern court. For nearly 60 years, Japan was split between two imperial lines, each claiming legitimacy. In 1338 CE, Takauji received the title of shogun, founding the Ashikaga shogunate. Unlike the Kamakura Bakufu, which had governed from distant Kamakura, the Ashikaga established their headquarters in Kyoto's Muromachi district, giving this era its alternative name. This proximity to the imperial court created a distinctive blend of aristocratic refinement and warrior power. The third Ashikaga shogun, Yoshimitsu, who ruled from 1368 to 1394 CE, temporarily strengthened central authority. He ended the imperial schism in 1392 CE, convincing the southern court to surrender its regalia and reunify the throne. Yoshimitsu also established formal trade relations with Ming China, opened diplomatic channels, and built the magnificent Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, whose gilded upper floors symbolized the fusion of warrior strength and aristocratic aesthetics. The Muromachi period, 1336 to 1573 CE, witnessed remarkable cultural flowering despite political instability. Zen Buddhism profoundly influenced art and aesthetics. Ink landscape painting flourished under masters like Sesshu Toyo. Dry landscape gardens, using carefully arranged rocks and raked gravel, expressed philosophical concepts through minimal means. No theater emerged as a refined performance art, combining dance, music, poetry, and mask drama. The tea ceremony evolved from casual gatherings into a highly formalized ritual art. The aesthetic of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in austerity, imperfection, and transience, began to define Japanese sensibility. Through tea ceremony, samurai could cultivate mental discipline, aesthetic discernment, and spiritual insight within a structured social context. These practices would shape Japanese culture for centuries. But the Ashikaga shogunate never achieved the centralized control of its Kamakura predecessor. Regional military governors, Shogo daimyo, evolved into powerful lords who maintained their own armies and governed their territories with minimal reference to Kyoto. While nominally loyal to the shogun, they pursued their own interests and often engaged in power struggles with one another. The fragility of shogunal authority became catastrophically clear in 1467 CE, when a succession dispute within the Ashikaga family erupted into the Unin War. What began as a conflict between rival factions in Kyoto spiraled into 11 years of destructive warfare that devastated the capital and spread throughout the provinces. By the time fighting subsided in 1477 CE, Kyoto lay in ruins, central authority had collapsed, and Japan entered the chaotic Sengoku period, the age of warring states. The Sengoku period, 1467 to 1600 CE, was an era of near-constant warfare. The nominal authority of both emperor and shogun faded into insignificance as regional warlords, daimyo, battled for supremacy. Political power derived purely from military strength. Traditional claims to legitimacy based on court appointment or aristocratic lineage carried little weight. This was a brutal age of ambition, betrayal, and survival. Ambitious daimyo carved out territorial domains, building castles, recruiting samurai retainers, and developing administrative systems to extract resources. Many rose from humble origins through military talent, a phenomenon called Gekkakujo, the low overcoming the high. Old hierarchies crumbled. Peasant's son could become a warlord. An established house could fall to upstart rivals. Nothing was permanent. Warfare evolved dramatically during this period. Traditional samurai preference for individual combat gave way to mass warfare. Large infantry armies of Ishigaru, foot soldiers recruited from the peasantry, became increasingly important. These commoner warriors carried spears, bows, and eventually firearms, fighting in coordinated units rather than as individual champions. The arrival of Europeans in 1543 CE revolutionized Japanese warfare. Portuguese traders landed on Tanegashima Island, bringing matchlock firearms. Japanese daimyo quickly recognized the weapon's potential, and within years, domestic smiths were mass-producing guns. By the 1570s, Japan possessed more firearms than any European nation. Castle construction flourished as daimyo sought defensible headquarters. Earlier fortifications evolved into complex stone fortresses with multiple defensive layers, moats, angled walls, and strategically placed towers. These castles served as military strongholds, administrative centers, and symbols of power, architectural achievements blending defense with aesthetic sophistication. Christian missionaries arrived alongside Portuguese traders. In 1549 CE, the Jesuit Francis Xavier introduced Christianity to Japan. The new religion spread rapidly, especially in Kyushu, where some daimyo converted, hoping to secure trade ties with the Portuguese. By the late 16th century, hundreds of thousands of Japanese had been baptized, and churches dotted the landscape. Amid this chaos, three remarkable leaders rose in succession: each pushing Japan closer to unification. The first was Oda Nobunaga, 1534 to 1582 CE, born heir to a minor warlord in Owari province. Nobunaga was unconventional, ruthless, and brilliant. In 1560 CE, at the Battle of Okahazama, he defeated the powerful Imagawa Yoshimoto with only a few thousand men in a surprise attack, announcing his arrival on the national stage. Over 2 decades, Nobunaga pursued relentless conquest, modernizing his armies with firearms and disciplined infantry. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575 CE, his musketeers devastated the cavalry of Takeda Katsuyori through coordinated volley fire behind wooden palisades, one of history's first decisive victories achieved through gunpowder weapons. Nobunaga also broke the power of entrenched institutions. He crushed the militant Buddhist Ikoiki leagues, besieging their fortress strongholds. In 1571 CE, he burned Mount Hai's monastery complex, massacring thousands of monks to eliminate threats to his authority. Nobunaga was as much destroyer as builder, clearing the old order to make way for a new Japan. But in 1582 CE, his career ended abruptly. While resting at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, Nobunaga was betrayed by his general Akechi Mitsuhide. Surrounded by enemy troops, he committed seppuku. The flames consumed his body, and his dream of unifying Japan passed to his followers. Yet his role as the first great unifier of the Sengoku period remains unchallenged. Into the vacuum stepped Toyotomi Hideyoshi, 1537 to 1598 CE, a man of even humbler origins. Born the son of a peasant foot soldier, Hideyoshi rose through talent and cunning to become Nobunaga's trusted general. After avenging Nobunaga by defeating Akechi Mitsuhide at Yamazaki in 1582 CE, Hideyoshi methodically consolidated power. By 1590 CE, after the siege of Odawara against the Hojo clan, he had unified virtually all of Japan. Hideyoshi's genius lay not only on the battlefield but in governance. He introduced nationwide land surveys, reorganized taxation, and enforced strict social hierarchies. His sword hunt edict of 1588 CE disarmed peasants, ensuring only samurai bore weapons and stabilizing his rule. He also patronized the arts lavishly, commissioning magnificent castles such as Osaka Castle and supporting the tea ceremony under San no Rikyu. Yet Hideyoshi's ambitions extended beyond Japan. In 1592 CE, he launched the first of the Imjin Wars, massive invasions of Korea intended as a springboard to conquer Ming China. Initially, Japanese armies achieved rapid success, seizing Seoul and Pyongyang. But fierce Korean resistance, aided by Chinese reinforcements and Korean naval victories under Admiral Yi Sun-sin, blunted the advance. After years of brutal stalemate, a second invasion in 1597 CE collapsed. When Hideyoshi died in 1598 CE, his exhausted armies withdrew, leaving devastation in Korea and draining Japan's resources. These wars would have lasting consequences, both diplomatic and cultural, shaping relations with Korea for centuries. Following Hideyoshi's death, a struggle for succession erupted. His infant son, Toyotomi Hideyori, was nominally his heir, but the real power vacuum invited rival factions. The strongest was led by Tokugawa Ieyasu, 1543 to 1616 CE, a patient and calculating warlord who had balanced loyalty and independence under Nobunaga and Hideyoshi. On October 21, 1600 CE, at the village of Sekigahara, two massive forces clashed in the largest and most consequential battle in Japanese history. Through superior preparation, strategic positioning, and crucially the defection of key enemy generals during the battle, Ieyasu won decisively. Sekigahara established Tokugawa Ieyasu as Japan's paramount power, allowing him to redistribute lands and reorganize Japan's feudal structure. 3 years later, in 1603 CE, the emperor appointed Ieyasu as shogun, founding the Tokugawa Shogunate. This new regime would endure for over 260 years, bringing unprecedented stability to Japan. In 1605 CE, Ieyasu formally retired, passing the shogunal title to his son Hidetada while continuing to wield power from behind the scenes, establishing a pattern that would ensure succession stability. Ieyasu understood that military victory alone could not guarantee lasting peace. He designed a system to prevent civil wars' return. At its core was the Bakuhan system, a federation of more than 250 daimyo domains, each with autonomy but all bound under Tokugawa supremacy. The shogunate directly controlled about 1/4 of Japan's agricultural land, strategically located around major cities and trade routes. To ensure loyalty, the Tokugawa instituted Sankenkotai, alternate attendance, formalized under Shogun Tokugawa Iemitsu in 1635 CE. This policy required daimyo to spend alternate years in Edo, modern Tokyo, and their home domains, while in Edo their families remained as hostages. This system curtailed rebellion, drained daimyo resources through expensive dual residences and travel, and fostered extraordinary cultural concentration in Edo, which grew into one of the world's largest cities. The early Tokugawa period also witnessed suppression of Christianity. European missionaries had gained tens of thousands of converts by the late 16th century. But by 1614 CE, Ieyasu issued an edict banning Christianity, fearing it as a threat to political unity and a potential avenue for European colonization. Persecution intensified. Missionaries were expelled, converts forced to recant, and resistors executed. The most dramatic Christian uprising came in the Shimabara Rebellion 1637 to 1638 CE, where tens of thousands of impoverished peasants, many Christians, rose against harsh taxation in Kyushu. The rebellion was brutally suppressed by Tokugawa forces, with an estimated 37,000 rebels and sympathizers killed. In its aftermath, the shogunate's hostility toward Christianity hardened into outright exclusion. This culminated in the Sengoku, closed country, policies. Between 1633 and 1639 CE, a series of edicts progressively restricted foreign trade and travel. Japanese were forbidden to leave the archipelago on pain of death. Returning emigrants were executed. Only limited contact remained. The Dutch, confined to the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor, Chinese traders, Korean diplomats, and the Ryukyu Kingdom under Satsuma control. Despite, or perhaps because of, this isolation, the Tokugawa era witnessed remarkable internal development. Agriculture expanded with new techniques and crops. By around 1720 CE, Japan's population had stabilized at roughly 30 million, one of the highest in the pre-modern world. Urbanization accelerated, with Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto forming great urban centers. Osaka became the kitchen of Japan, serving as the hub of rice distribution and financial markets. The Jinroku period, 1688 to 1704 CE, is remembered as a cultural golden age. Kabuki theater thrived with dramatists like Chikamatsu Manzaemon crafting plays exploring love, honor, and tragedy. Ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world, emerged, with woodblock prints by artists such as Kitagawa Utamaro and later Katsushika Hokusai depicting pleasure quarters and landscapes. The haiku form reached perfection under Matsuo Basho, whose travel sketches remain masterpieces of Japanese literature. Intellectual life developed in new directions. Through Dutch traders at Dejima, Western books and ideas trickled into Japan, a current known as Rangaku or Dutch learning. Japanese scholars studied Western medicine, astronomy, and technology. The 1774 CE publication of Kaitai Shinsho, a translation of a European anatomical text, demonstrated the accuracy of Western scientific knowledge, gradually shifting intellectual authority from classical texts toward empirical investigation. The Tokugawa social order was rigidly structured into 4 main classes: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants in descending order of prestige. Samurai, though only about 7% of the population, were the ruling elite, supported by stipends paid in rice. Peasants produced that rice and were legally bound to the land. Artisans provided goods. Merchants, officially lowest, gained immense economic power through commerce and finance. But economic realities eroded this neat hierarchy. By the 18th century, many samurai lived in poverty while merchants grew wealthy, creating tensions that would simmer until the end of Tokugawa rule. The shogunate faced several crises: famines, financial difficulties, and reform movements that sought to restore order through austerity and moral discipline, often provoking resentment without addressing deeper imbalances. Externally, the greatest challenge came from expanding Western powers. By the early 19th century, Russian envoys, British whalers, and American ships appeared increasingly off Japanese coasts. The shogunate resisted, reasserting its closed country policy. In 1825 CE, an edict ordered foreign ships repelled by force. Yet the balance of power was shifting inexorably. The shock came in July 1853 CE, when Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy sailed into Edo Bay with 4 steam-powered warships, black ships bristling with cannon. His arrival exposed Japan's vulnerability. Perry demanded the opening of ports to American trade and threatened bombardment if refused. After tense negotiations, the shogunate signed the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854 CE, opening Shimoda and Hakodate to American ships. Similar treaties followed with Britain, Russia, and the Netherlands. These unequal treaties granted extraterritorial rights to foreigners and fixed low import tariffs, deep humiliations highlighting Japan's weakness. The opening destabilized the Tokugawa regime. Many samurai and intellectuals rallied under the slogan Sano Joy, "Revere the emperor, expel the barbarians," seeing the shogunate's concessions as betrayal. Domains such as Chashu and Satsuma, long-standing rivals of the Tokugawa, became hotbeds of opposition. The imperial court in Kyoto, long politically marginal, emerged as a symbolic center of resistance. By the 1860s, the Tokugawa system was crumbling. The shogunate attempted reforms, but it was too late. In 1867 CE, the last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, resigned, formally returning power to the emperor. In 1868 CE, conflict erupted between Tokugawa loyalists and forces aligned with Satsuma and Chashu. In the brief but decisive BoshinWar, 1868 to 1869 CE, imperial forces triumphed, leading to the Meiji Restoration. This event ended the Tokugawa shogunate and ushered in a new era of rapid modernization and global engagement. The sword of the samurai would be sheathed, but Japan's transformation had only just begun. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 CE marked both a return and a revolution. The emperor, long a symbolic figure, was restored as sovereign authority. Yet reforms carried out in his name transformed Japan into a modern nation-state. The young Emperor Mutsuhito, who reigned as Emperor Meiji from 1867 to 1912, became the symbolic heart of transformation, though real power lay with oligarchs from Satsuma and Chashu. In 1868 CE, the government issued the Charter Oath, promising deliberative assemblies, social mobility, and pursuit of knowledge from around the world. One of the first steps was abolition of the old feudal domains. In 1871 CE, the Heian reforms dismantled the Han system, replacing it with uniform prefectures directly under central government. Daimyo were compensated with bonds, and many were absorbed into the new nobility. The samurai class, long the backbone of Japan's social order, was gradually stripped of privileges. In 1873 CE, universal conscription created a modern national army. Samurai stipends were commuted into bonds, and by the 1870s, the right to wear swords was abolished. These measures eroded samurai identity, leading to unrest. The most famous uprising came in 1877 CE with the Satsuma Rebellion, led by Seigo Takamori, once a hero of the Restoration but now disillusioned. The imperial army, trained in Western tactics and equipped with modern weaponry, defeated the rebels. Seigo was killed at the Battle of Shiroyama on September 24, 1877 CE. The rebellion's defeat signaled the end of the samurai as a political force and confirmed the success of Japan's new military system, built not on hereditary warrior status but on universal conscription and modern discipline. Industrialization accelerated rapidly. In 1872 CE, Japan built its first railway connecting Tokyo to Yokohama. Telegraph lines, postal systems, and modern banking followed. The government initially invested heavily in model factories, from textiles to shipyards, before selling many to private entrepreneurs in the 1880s. This gave rise to zaibatsu, family-controlled conglomerates such as Mitsui, Mitsubishi, and Sumitomo, which would dominate Japan's economy for decades. Education was overhauled to support modernization. The Education Order of 1872 CE established a national school system emphasizing literacy, practical knowledge, and loyalty to the state. Universities trained a new generation of bureaucrats, scientists, and professionals. Study missions were sent abroad, most famously the Iwakura Mission, 1871 to 1873 CE, in which leading officials toured the United States and Europe to learn from Western institutions. Politically, the Meiji leaders sought to balance reform with control. Pressure from the freedom and people's rights movement pushed for constitutional government. After years of debate, the Meiji Constitution was promulgated in 1889 CE, creating a constitutional monarchy modeled partly on Prussia. Sovereignty was vested in the emperor, who commanded the military and could dissolve parliament. Yet the constitution also established an elected lower house and an appointed upper house, marking a significant step toward representative government. Foreign policy became an arena where the Meiji state sought to assert itself. Revising the unequal treaties signed in the 1850s became a national priority. Diplomacy, backed by Japan's growing military strength, gradually bore fruit. By the 1890s, Japan had regained tariff autonomy. More dramatically, Japan asserted itself through war. The First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895 CE, began over influence in Korea. After Japanese victories at Pyongyang and the Yalu River, China recognized Korean independence, ceded Taiwan and the Pescadores, and paid a large indemnity through the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895 CE. However, the triple intervention by Russia, France, and Germany forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula, a humiliation that fueled resentment and military buildup. Japan's growing power set it on a collision course with Russia. Tensions over Korea and Manchuria culminated in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905 CE. Japan struck first with a surprise attack on Port Arthur in February 1904 CE. Over the next year, Japanese forces won remarkable victories, including the Battle of Mukden and the Battle of Tsushima, where Admiral Togo Hiehikaro's fleet annihilated the Russian Navy. The Treaty of Portsmouth, brokered by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt in September 1905 CE, confirmed Japan's status as a great power. Russia recognized Japan's predominance in Korea, ceded Port Arthur and southern Sakhalin, and withdrew from southern Manchuria. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a European great power, inspiring anti-colonial movements worldwide. Domestically, Japan tightened its grip on Korea. In 1905 CE, Korea became a protectorate, and in 1910 CE, it was formally annexed as a colony. Taiwan, acquired in 1895 CE, was also integrated with infrastructure projects and industrial investments transforming its economy. This expansion marked the beginning of Japan's imperial age, a trajectory that would shape its destiny throughout the 20th century. By the time Emperor Meiji died on July 30, 1912 CE, Japan had transformed beyond recognition. In 1868 CE, it had been a semi-feudal society on the periphery of world affairs. By 1912 CE, it was a centralized constitutional monarchy, an industrialized power with colonies, a modern military, and a seat at the table of international diplomacy. The Meiji era was a revolution in every sense: political, economic, social, and cultural. The Taisho era, 1912 to 1926 CE, is often described as a period of Taisho democracy. Though beneath the surface lay deep currents of social unrest, economic challenges, and militarist ambitions, Emperor Taisho himself was a weak figure, afflicted with illness and mental instability, playing little active role in governance. This allowed for the gradual rise of party politics and parliamentary influence. Japan's entry into World War I, 1914 to 1918 CE, reshaped its domestic and international standing. Allied with Britain, Japan declared war on Germany, swiftly seizing German possessions in China's Shandong Peninsula and German islands in Micronesia. While Japan's military contribution was limited, the war provided expansion opportunities and an economic boom as Japanese industries supplied goods to Asia and beyond. In 1915 CE, Japan issued the infamous 21 demands to China, seeking sweeping privileges. International protests forced Japan to scale back its demands, but the aggressive diplomacy deepened suspicion among Western powers and fueled Chinese nationalism. The war years brought prosperity but also inflation. Rice prices doubled between 1914 and 1918 CE, leading to the rice riots of 1918, nationwide protests involving over 10 million participants. The 1920s brought both progress and tension. In 1925 CE, the general election law granted universal male suffrage to all men over 25, enfranchising about 12 million voters, a landmark in Japanese democracy. Yet in the same year, the peace preservation law allowed harsh penalties against those advocating abolition of private property, or the Kokutai, emperor-centered national polity, targeting socialists, communists, and labor activists. The Great Kanto earthquake of September 1, 1923 CE devastated Tokyo and Yokohama, killing over 100,000 people and leaving millions homeless. The disaster also unleashed violence against Koreans and leftists, as rumors spread that they had poisoned wells or planned uprisings. Thousands of Koreans were massacred in vigilante and police violence, highlighting dark undercurrents of nationalism and xenophobia. The late 1920s brought further turmoil. The Showa financial crisis of 1927 CE, triggered by bank failures, undermined confidence in party cabinets. The global Great Depression, 1929 CE, hit Japan hard. Exports collapsed by 50%, rural poverty deepened, and faith in parliamentary politics eroded. Meanwhile, militarism gained ground. Army officers, frustrated by perceived diplomatic humiliations and economic hardship, saw expansion in Asia as both solution and destiny. The transition to the Showa era came with Emperor Taisho's death on December 25, 1926 CE. His son, Emperor Showa Hirohito, 1901 to 1989, ascended the throne. His reign would become the longest in Japanese history, encompassing the rise of militarism, the devastation of World War II, and post-war reconstruction. The early years of his reign were overshadowed by growing instability. The breaking point came in 1931 CE. On September 18, 1931 CE, officers of the Guangdong Army staged the Mukden Incident, blowing up a section of the South Manchuria Railway and blaming Chinese forces. Using this as pretext, the Japanese army launched a full invasion of Manchuria without authorization from Tokyo. Within months, they occupied the region and established the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932 CE. The civilian government was powerless to stop them. The League of Nations condemned Japan's actions, sending the Lytton Commission to investigate. Its report refused to recognize Manchukuo and declared Japan the aggressor. In response, Japan withdrew from the League in March 1933 CE, symbolizing its estrangement from the Western-dominated international order. Political violence intensified inside Japan. Between 1932 and 1936 CE, a wave of assassinations and coup attempts shook the foundations of party politics. The May 15th incident, 1932 CE, saw naval officers assassinate Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi, effectively ending party cabinets. The February 26th incident, 1936 CE, involved nearly 1,500 young officers staging a coup in Tokyo, assassinating ministers and occupying parts of the city before being suppressed. While Japan turned inward politically, it also turned aggressively outward. Tensions in China boiled over into full-scale war in July 1937 CE. On the night of July 7, 1937 CE, shots were fired near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing, escalating rapidly into the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese forces captured Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, and in December 1937 CE, Nanjing. The capture of Nanjing unleashed one of the most infamous atrocities of the 20th century, the Nanjing Massacre. Over 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers killed an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war, committing widespread rape, looting, and destruction. Though denied by the Japanese government at the time, the atrocities were documented by foreign observers and remain a dark stain on Japan's history. Japan sought to crush Chinese resistance quickly, but the war dragged on. Nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek moved his capital inland to Chongqing, and Chinese forces, though poorly equipped, fought on. The conflict consumed vast resources and manpower. By 1939 CE, nearly 1 million Japanese soldiers were stationed in China, but victory remained elusive. Japan moved closer to the Axis powers. In September 1940 CE, Japan signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, formally creating the Axis alliance. That same year, Japan occupied northern Vietnam after France's defeat by Nazi Germany. In July 1941 CE, Japan extended its occupation to southern Indochina, gaining control over bases within striking distance of the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, rich in oil. The United States, alarmed by Japanese aggression, responded with escalating sanctions. In July 1941 CE, President Franklin D. Roosevelt froze all Japanese assets in the United States and imposed an oil embargo along with Britain and the Netherlands. This was devastating. Japan imported about 80% of its oil from the U.S., and without it, its military would grind to a halt within 2 years. Faced with this crisis, Japan's leaders debated their course. Negotiations collapsed as Japan refused to withdraw from China. By autumn 1941 CE, the cabinet, now dominated by General Tojo Hideki, prepared for war. On December 1, 1941 CE, the Imperial Conference formally approved the decision. Even as diplomats continued discussions in Washington, the Japanese Navy prepared a daring preemptive strike. At dawn on December 7, 1941 CE, December 8 in Japan, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. They sank or damaged 8 battleships, destroyed hundreds of aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. Simultaneous strikes hit U.S. bases in the Philippines, British Malaya, and Hong Kong. The Pacific War had begun. Initially, Japanese forces seemed unstoppable. They conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and numerous Pacific islands, declaring this vast territory the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But holding these conquests proved impossible. Japan faced supply problems, fierce resistance, and the industrial might of the United States. The Battle of Midway, June 1942 CE, marked a turning point. The U.S. Navy dealt a heavy blow to Japan's carrier fleet, shifting the strategic balance. From then on, Japan was mostly on the defensive. The Allies adopted an island-hopping strategy, capturing strategic locations while bypassing heavily fortified islands, gradually closing in on Japan's home islands. As the war dragged on, Japan turned to desperate measures. Kamikaze attacks, suicide missions where pilots crashed their planes into enemy ships, began in 1944 CE. Japan's leaders refused to surrender even as defeat became inevitable. Allied forces firebombed Japanese cities, causing immense destruction. Tokyo, Osaka, and other cities were reduced to ash. Yet still, Japan fought on. Then came the ultimate horror. On August 6, 1945 CE, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, obliterating the city and killing over 70,000 people instantly. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945 CE, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. That same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Faced with these unprecedented catastrophes, Japan finally surrendered. On August 15, 1945 CE, Emperor Hirohito's voice was broadcast on radio for the first time, announcing Japan's surrender. World War II had ended. Japan's empire was gone. The cities were in ruins. Millions were dead. The nation faced occupation, rebuilding, and an uncertain future. Yet from the ashes, a new Japan would rise. The American occupation, 1945 to 1952 CE, under General Douglas MacArthur reshaped Japanese society. The military was disbanded. War criminals were tried. A new constitution was drafted in 1947 CE, establishing a parliamentary democracy, granting universal suffrage, and including Article 9, which renounced war. Emperor Hirohito was stripped of divine status, becoming a symbolic figurehead. Land reforms redistributed property to tenant farmers. Education was reformed to promote democratic values. Women gained the vote. Labor unions were legalized. American aid helped rebuild infrastructure and industry. The reforms aimed to transform Japan from a militaristic empire into a peaceful democracy, and largely succeeded. When the occupation officially ended in 1952 CE, Japan had taken its first steps toward becoming an economic powerhouse. The 1950s and 1960s witnessed the Japanese economic miracle, rapid growth fueled by government policies, U.S. aid, favorable trade conditions, and a highly educated, disciplined workforce. Industries like steel, automobiles, electronics, and shipbuilding flourished. By the 1970s, Japan had become the world's second-largest economy. Japanese goods, Toyota cars, Sony electronics, Panasonic appliances, flooded global markets. The Shinkansen, bullet train, launched in 1964 CE, showcased Japan's technological prowess. Companies like Honda, Canon, and Nintendo became household names. Japanese culture, from anime and manga to cuisine, gained international popularity. But economic success brought new challenges. The 1980s saw Japan's asset price bubble, a speculative frenzy in real estate and stock markets. When the bubble burst in the early 1990s, Japan entered the lost decade, a prolonged period of economic stagnation, deflation, and slow growth. The Nikkei stock index, which had peaked at 38,957 points in 1989 CE, crashed dramatically. Despite economic struggles, Japan maintained its position as a technological and cultural leader. Robotics, high-speed rail, and precision manufacturing continued to showcase Japanese innovation. Culturally, Japan's global influence flourished. Anime, manga, video games, fashion, and cuisine remained global phenomena. Events like the planned Tokyo 2020 Olympics symbolized Japan's desire to present itself as modern, vibrant, and resilient. Japan's most intractable problem remained demographics. The population, which peaked around 128 million in 2010 CE, entered steady decline. By 2020 CE, it had fallen below 126 million. The share of those aged 65 and older rose to nearly 30%, the highest proportion in the world. This reality strained pension and healthcare systems, hollowed out rural areas, and raised profound questions about Japan's future. On March 11, 2011 CE, Japan experienced one of its most devastating events. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck off the Tohoku coast, triggering a massive tsunami with waves over 40 meters high. Nearly 20,000 people died or went missing. Entire towns were obliterated. The disaster deepened when the tsunami disabled the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, causing meltdowns and the worst nuclear disaster since Chernobyl. The 3.11 disaster, as it's known, left lasting scars. It revealed vulnerabilities in energy policy, shook faith in nuclear safety, and raised questions about government transparency. Yet it also demonstrated Japan's resilience. Reconstruction efforts began immediately. Disaster preparedness systems were improved. The nation mourned, rebuilt, and persevered. Political stability returned under Shinzo Abe, Japan's longest-serving prime minister, 2012 to 2020. Abe introduced Abenomics, aggressive monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, and structural reforms to revive the economy. Results were mixed, but his leadership restored direction. He also pursued a more assertive foreign policy, strengthening the U.S.-Japan alliance and deepening regional ties amid China's rise. Under Abe, Japan recognized China's rise as both economic partner and strategic rival. Disputes over the Sengoku Islands intensified. Abe responded by bolstering Japan's self-defense forces, increasing defense spending, and reinterpreting Japan's pacifist constitution to allow limited collective self-defense. Japan also promoted regional cooperation through the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy. The 2020s brought new crises. The COVID-19 pandemic, first reported in Japan in January 2020 CE, hit the economy hard. GDP shrank by 4.3% in 2020 CE. The Tokyo Olympics, postponed from 2020 to 2021, were held under strict protocols without foreign spectators. a muted celebration overshadowed by pandemic concerns and public opposition. Abe resigned in August 2020 CE due to health issues. His successor, Yoshihide Suga, struggled with pandemic management and low approval ratings, resigning after just 1 year. Fumio Kishida became prime minister in October 2021, emphasizing a new capitalism, addressing inequality and strengthening alliances amid US-China rivalry. In July 2022 CE, Japan was shocked when former Prime Minister Abe was assassinated during a campaign speech in Nara, the first assassination of a Japanese leader in the modern democratic era. The event symbolically ended the Heisei-era politics that had shaped Japan since the 1990s and sparked debate about political influence and transparency. Between 2020 and 2025, Japan's external environment grew more complex. China's assertiveness in the East China Sea, North Korea's missile tests, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 CE all challenged Japanese security. Kishida positioned Japan firmly within the coalition of democracies, enhancing its role in the G7, strengthening the US-Japan alliance, and deepening ties through the Quad. Domestically, Japan continued to struggle with demographic decline. By 2025, the population had fallen to around 125 million. Kishida promoted policies to support families and raise birth rates, but critics doubted whether such measures could reverse deep-rooted social trends. Economically, Japan faced rising energy costs, supply chain disruptions, and inflation driven by global shocks. Despite challenges, Japan's cultural influence remained immense. Anime, manga, video games, and fashion captivated global audiences. Series like Demon Slayer and Attack on Titan achieved worldwide popularity. Japanese video game giants like Nintendo and Sony dominated the industry. Japanese cuisine maintained its global prominence. Athletes like Naomi Osaka and Shohei Ohtani symbolized a new generation of globally recognized Japanese figures. Technologically, Japan invested heavily in robotics, artificial intelligence, and green energy. The government promoted hydrogen power and offshore wind projects, aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050. Though criticized for falling behind in digital transformation, Japan began accelerating reforms to digitize government services and adapt to the global tech race. By 2025, Japan stands at a crossroads. It is a nation of contradictions. Wealthy yet aging, technologically advanced yet facing social challenges, peaceful yet increasingly militarized. Its democracy remains stable, but voter apathy and distrust of political elites linger. The legacy of disasters, both natural and man-made, continues to shape its psyche. Yet Japan has also shown remarkable resilience and adaptability. It has rebuilt after catastrophe, maintained global cultural influence, and positioned itself as a key player in the Indo-Pacific. Kishida's leadership seeks to balance caution with assertiveness as Japan prepares for an uncertain future shaped by US-China rivalry and global instability. The story of Japan from ancient Jaman hunters to modern technological society is a testament to transformation. It is a tale of isolation and engagement, tradition and innovation, defeat and triumph. From the mist-shrouded forests of prehistory to the neon-lit streets of contemporary Tokyo, Japan has continually reinvented itself while preserving its unique cultural identity. Its challenges are formidable, but so too is its resilience. Close your eyes. The thunder of battle is gone. The smoke of reconstruction has cleared. You are standing on the shore where the first Jaman people once pressed cords into clay. Behind you, 14,000 years of history fade like morning mist. The samurai's blade, the emperor's scroll, the atomic fire, the bullet train racing toward tomorrow. Above you, Amaterasu's light still touches the islands at the edge of Asia. The stones remember, the waves remember, and in this moment between sleeping and waking, between past and future, you carry their story forward. If you enjoyed this journey through Japan's remarkable history, please like this video, subscribe to Whispered Empires, and ring the bell so you never miss our explorations into the mysteries of ancient civilizations. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the whispers of empires long past.